Buonasera a tutti e benvenuti all'Italian Academy. Good evening and welcome to the Italian Academy. I am Barbara Faed, Assistant Director, and I am delighted to welcome you all today to our third annual symposium on the Day of Remembrance. Last year, Professor Katznelson gave us a clearer idea of what happened to Jews in the US during the decades of Italian fascism. This year we come back to Italy to focus on a specific and very important part of Jewish and Italian history, the ghetto in Rome. We will learn from Professor Stow about the institution of the ghetto in 1555 and how segregation did not hamper interesting cultural developments and the flowering, strength and continuity of what he defines in his book as a vibrant subculture. Dr. Oryshkevich will offer an overview of the urban and artistic fabric of Rome of that period. Kenneth Stow is Professor of Jewish History Emeritus at the University of Haifa and has been named Visiting Professor at Yale University, Smith College, Hebrew University in Jerusalem, the University of Massachusetts Amherst, the University of Toronto, and at the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome, among others. He is the author of many books and articles, and nearly 25 years ago he founded and still edits the international journal Jewish History. Irina Oryshkevich is an art historian studying Rome from late antiquity to the early modern period. She has been a fellow at the Italian Academy and at the Society of Fellows at Columbia University, and a recipient of a grant from the American Association of University Women. At the end of the event, we will have a Q&A session, and then we can keep talking with a drink on the first floor. Now, please join me in welcoming our speakers. Thank you.
Will the light stay this? Oh, okay, good. Okay, so accommodating Jews in the New Jerusalem. And let me just say that I am much more of an expert in the New Jerusalem than the Old Jerusalem, but hopefully that will help you understand the situation better. It was at no arbitrary moment in history when on July 14, 1555, Pope Paul IV ruled that henceforth all the Jews of Italy were to reside in walled communities. His infamous bull, De Nimis Absurdis, which set the rules for the Roman ghetto, appeared at a turning point in the Roman Church, as it was actively formulating ecclesiastical policy and internal reform at the Council of Trent, which dragged on from 1545 to 1563. It also coincided more or less with the papacy's realization that it had lost half of Europe to the Protestants for good. Finally, it was just around this time, as its agenda shifted from defensive to offensive, that it began parading its status as the New Jerusalem, the divinely ordained replacement for the Old Testament capital and the prefiguration of paradise. The concept of Rome as the New Jerusalem was not an invention of the Counter-Reformation. It can be traced, in fact, to late antiquity, but it was one that had lost much of its panache in the late Middle Ages when the city entered a state of physical and moral decline that eventually earned it the more apropos name New Babylon. But when, in the 15th century, the papacy finally returned to Rome from Avignon and slowly began refurbishing the capital to something of its former splendor, it came once again to regard its geographical base in an eschatological light, seeing in its physical transformation both a sign of God's forgiveness and a manifestation of the triumph over Satan. And here you have Raphael's famous fresco with the construction of St. Peter's on the left side, on the detail. As the Reformation blazed across Europe, the papacy came to rely ever more on the rhetoric of New Jerusalem to uphold its primacy. The epithet, in fact, appears in countless sermons, devotional and polemical tracts, ecclesiastical histories, pilgrimage itineraries, and in guidebooks, especially those published during the Great Jubilees, which drew thousands of visitors to Rome each quarter century. Thus, in 1588, Pompeo Ugonio, a teacher of rhetoric in the Jesuit college and canon Garden of St. Peter's, opened as Storia delle Stazioni di Roma, a long and erudite treatise on the stational churches of Rome, with a list of the advantages of New Jerusalem over its predecessor, noting, for example, that whereas Jerusalem had had only one resplendent temple and one distinguished king, Solomon, whose reign had been but temporary, Rome had many amazing churches and scores of illustrious popes whose reign would stretch until the Second Coming. The concept of New Jerusalem was applied in a variety of creative ways. Gian Lorenzo Bernini gave it visual form in the Solomonic columns of his new baldacchino at St. Peter's, a church frequently equated with Solomon's temple. The topography of Old Jerusalem was also mystically superimposed on its modern counterpart in the processions to Rome's 7 stational churches, each of which represented an episode in Christ's Passion and was thus associated with a specific location in Jerusalem. The rhetorical campaign was accompanied by massive urban renewal. Old churches were restored or rebuilt, new avenues laid out in radiating lines and piazzas, fountains, palaces, and gardens constructed according to the classicizing principles of Renaissance aesthetics, making New Jerusalem, and by extension its celestial counterpart, resemble the resplendent marble capital of Caesar Augustus, at least as it appeared in the nostalgic imagination of a humanistically educated elite. How Jews felt about New Jerusalem is a very different question. Certainly, Paul IV's draconian measures were not designed to make them feel at home. Within 2 days of the bull's publication, all the Jews were forced to relocate in the designated area, a short strip along the Tiber by the Ponte Quattro Capi. 2 weeks later, Salustio Peruzzi, son of the more famous Baldassare, was hired to build a wall around the area, extending from the portico of Octavian, but excluding it, to the Piazza Giudea, which is split in half. The cost of the operation was borne by the Jewish community. Although Paul IV had insisted that each ghetto in the Papal States have only 2 portals, 3 initially were inserted in Rome, one opening onto Piazza Giudea, the other 2 by the portico of Octavian and the Ponte Quattro Capi. One by one, the Christian churches inside the walls were deconsecrated and either razed or converted to serve other functions. And on the left, you see the area of the ghetto. Is right here. It's very tiny, and this just gives you a sense of the size after it was raised. Okay. Segregation was reinforced by a host of regulations. Jews could not own fixed property. Their homes were to be confiscated and handed over to Christian landlords from whom they had to rent. They were forbidden to have Christian servants or wet nurses and could not work as physicians outside their community. The portals of the ghetto were locked after sundown each day and for 4 full days at Easter each year by Christian sentries whose salaries were to be covered by the community. Although Jews were granted permission to worship, they could have only one synagogue despite the ethnic differences separating them. When they left the area, they needed to wear a colored token of some sort. Initially, this consisted of a red cap for men and red shawl for women, but the color was later changed to yellow to prevent Christians from mistaking the men for cardinals. The official pretext for the measures was to remind Jews that their guilt made them subject to eternal servitude, to punish them for their insolence and insufficient gratitude to Christians, and to hasten their conversion to the true Catholic faith. Although some of the rules were relaxed or modified after Paul's death in 1559, the walls of the ghetto did not come down until 1848. The location of the ghetto was a pragmatic choice since 80% of Roman Jews already lived in the area. Although enlarged by Sixtus V later in the century and again by Leo XII in the 19th, the area was indisputably tight, a total of 7 acres, which is a tad more than one New York City block, for about 4,000 people. Some pictures here. The houses along Via Fiumara, and these are those, whose backs rose precipitously from the river, were inundated with mud whenever the Tiber flooded. As Sixtus V himself admitted when granting the wall's expansion in the 1580s, the neighborhood was subject to infestation and thus a pestilential threat to the entire city. Fresh water, too, posed a problem. At first, Jews seemed to have drawn it from the Tiber, but in 1614, Paul V mercifully had pipes extended to Piazza Tempio, where he installed a fountain against the wall, decorating it with a 7-branch candelabrum and his name. And this is actually a 19th century watercolor, and you can see the fountain here against the wall. Compared to Rome's many other fountains, including the ones right outside the ghetto, it was a pathetic trickle. So this is a fountain right outside the ghetto at the wall, and this, of course, is Piazza Navona with all of Bernini's fountains. Since the Jews could not build outwards and were thus forced to cap already precarious structures with additional floors, the ghetto streets were tight and eternally bathed in shadow. Descriptions of the area by visitors invariably refer to its squalor, to the stench emanating from its refuse-infested alleys, and to the inescapable din of screaming women and children. The pictures created by such impressions is all the more disturbing when one recalls that in the late 16th century, much of the city was still underpopulated and covered with barren stretches of land. The Jews of the ghetto came from a variety of ethnic backgrounds. Before Paul IV's decree, each of these groups had had its own synagogue, 11 in toto. After it was put into effect, however, all the synagogues were disbanded for a brief period until 5 of them were given permission to reopen in one building, which came to be known as the Cinque Scole. And that's a 19th century photograph. It burnt down after they tore down the ghetto. They saved the building, but eventually it burnt down. These included the Scola Tempio of the indigenous Roman Jews, the Scola Nuova of the more recent Italian arrivals, as well as the Scola Catalana, Scola Castigliana, and Scola Siciliana, run by the exiles from Spain's dominion. Each of these occupied a portion of the structure and engaged in periodic territorial disputes. The Scola Tempio, which claimed the longest routes in the city, for example, assumed exclusive rights over the building's main staircase. In addition to attending their own services, a certain percentage of Jews were forced to listen to weekly Christian sermons, often delivered by Jewish converts on Saturdays in San Angelo di Pescaria. And that's this church here, which is actually built into the portico of Octavian. Initially, 2 of the ghetto's portals faced churches, Sant'Angelo in Pescaria, by the portico of Octavian, and San Gregorio on the eastern end of Ponte Quattro Capi. That's this one here. In 1609, construction on yet another one, Santa Maria del Pianto, was begun at Piazza Giudea. Its original plan included an open piazza that ensured that the building would have no tangential contact with the Jewish quarter, as well as a large dome that would have loomed over the ghetto and been visible from the synagogue. So this is a map somebody made. So this is the original plan. This would have been the new church there, and it's right here. Although neither of these were completed, the properties acquired for the project were covered with images of the Madonna and the badge of the confraternity in charge of the church. In the early 18th century, a disproportionately large crucifix was also frescoed onto the facade of San Gregorio, presumably to provide Jews with a daily reminder of their so-called crime. True, there was some construction in the ghetto itself. Although Jews could not own fixed property, they could acquire hereditary lifelong leases that granted them permission to modify homes. The problem was space. There was no room to expand anywhere but upwards, and with 4,000 inhabitants to shelter, certainly no spare footage to waste on piazzas, courtyards, palaces, gardens, or monuments. Compare the two. lack of space essentially made it impossible for even those with means, and there were some, to participate in the beautification campaign that was turning the rest of Rome into a harbinger of paradise. For all these reasons, the ghetto's narrow thoroughfares, tottering buildings, and cramped, irregular squares bathed in the Tiber's mud and the wall's perpetual shadow must have appeared that much more anomalous among the new axially planned avenues, classical facades, Baroque waterworks, and manicured gardens sprouting periodically elsewhere in the city. Denied the benefits of the church's renovatio, the ghetto was sequestered not only in terms of space, but also time. Whereas the gradually emerging cityscape of Christian Rome conformed to Renaissance ideas of harmony, order, proportion, and symmetry, the ghetto, lopsided, chaotic, built by haphazard accretion rather than rational design, seemed decidedly stuck in the barbarous Dark Ages, a period that by the late Cinquecento had been utterly dismissed by architects, patrons, and connoisseurs as awkward and hideous, goffa, as the Italians would say. The architectural style of the Jews, forced on them by Christian discrimination, was yet another manifestation of their backwardness and ignorance. Thus, if the perfect symmetry, proportion, and classical order of New St. Peter's projected an image of Catholic unity, godliness, and power, masking as it did so the Pope's insecurity over lost territory, the patched quality of the Cinque Scole, decidedly more medieval than classical, denoted its users' lack of unity, moral crookedness, and spiritual myopia. And if the new parts of the city were reminders that this was the New Jerusalem, the prefiguration of paradise, then the narrow, dark alleys and precarious structures of the ghetto were a reminder that its inhabitants were not destined for salvation. Incapable of accepting Christ as their Messiah, they were frozen in time, stuck in archaic ritual, and incapable of progress, even in the sphere of aesthetics. In short, as the majesty and concinita of New Jerusalem gave its residents a glimpse of heaven, the ghetto gave those who refused to convert a foretaste of hell. The anachronism notwithstanding, to the chief executives of the Counter-Reformation, the Old Testament was in certain ways comparable to the Middle Ages, since in their estimation both periods had been characterized by obscurity, superstition, and senseless ritual. Interesting in this respect are observations made by numerous Christian visitors to the ghetto, which express nothing but derision for the incomprehensible and quote-unquote barbarous, a word they use over and over again, howling incantations and ritualistic practices that they encountered there. Equally telling, though hardly surprising, is the ghetto's absence in guidebooks to the modern sites of Rome, whose itineraries often pass straight by the Portico of Octavian and Theater of Marcellus. And you see right here is the Portico of Octavian. And all the guidebooks tell people to go there, but they kept it outside the ghetto. Indeed, in designing his wall, Peruzzi seems to have carefully avoided enclosing the Portico of Octavian, a classical ruin of potential interest to antiquarians and tourists. Although cartographers often did mark the area in their maps and bird-eye views, they were clearly too enamored of the overall pattern of the city's topography to render the extreme narrowness of the ghetto streets with scientific precision. And again, they are here, but they're so tiny you would never notice, and of course the streets look just as wide as all the other streets. One wonders how the Jews felt about their physical surroundings, especially before viewers. An appreciation for the architectural and artistic forms that they encountered outside their minuscule world is evident here and there. There are, for example, a number of Renaissance elements in the interior of the Scola Tempio, including a classical aedicula with Corinthian columns and a coffered ceiling of the sort one often encounters in Rome's Renaissance churches, a detail not lost on Ferdinand Gregorovius, who visited the ghetto in 1853. So here are the coffers, and there's the aedicula. Noteworthy, too, is that when the congregation of the Scuola Catalana redid its space in the Cinque Scuole, it hired the Christian Girolamo Reinaldi, a pupil of Sixtus V's chief architect Domenico Fontana, to design the chamber in a classical style. Also fascinating are the words of a 17th century tourist, Jovan de Rochefort, who claimed that the Jews were willing to pay 100,000 écus for Michelangelo's sculpture of Moses. Indeed, documents and inventories reveal that many Jews dealt in smaller works of Renaissance art, including devotional paintings and crucifixes, which they took as pawns for loans made to Christian clients, often indigent artists. Perhaps their power to commodify the Christian's Messiah was a surreptitious form of revenge. But for all the Renaissance art they kept behind closed doors, there was little they could do about the dismal front they were forced to present to the world at large. Despite its external grime and squalor, the ghetto did play a role in the larger agenda of addressing Rome as the New Jerusalem. For one, it quarantined Jews, prevented them from, quote-unquote, tainting the Christian city, and thus helped uphold the illusion of an immaculate, godly Rome, regardless of its reliance on Jewish loans. But it also served an important function in the papacy's visual propaganda. Though tiny, it was in a fairly central location, and visible to the thousands of Christians who joined the procession to the 7 stational churches several times each year, as well as to antiquarian-minded tourists exploring the remains of the Theater of Marcellus and the Portico of Octavian. Dark, dirty, and segregated by a wall, the ghetto must have appeared to such passers-by as the antithesis of all the other areas of Rome under direct papal control. Although in 1555 Paul IV may have hoped that his punitive measures would encourage the Jews to convert and hasten the Second Coming, it is unlikely that their unanimous conversion would have pleased either him or his successors. Papal vacillation on the matter is reflected in its lame attempts to brainwash them. Although Gregory XIII stipulated that 1/3 of the ghetto's population over the age of 12, both male and female, attend the obligatory weekly sermons, Michel de Montaigne, who came to Rome in 1581 and witnessed several such functions, specified that only 60 individuals, all men, were in attendance each time. In the early 1640s, when John Evelyn visited Rome, he observed that a sermon was preached to the Jews at Ponte Sisto, who, quote, are constrained to sit till the hour is done, but it is with so much malice in their countenances, spitting, humming, coughing, and motion, that it is almost impossible they should hear a word from their preacher. A conversion is very rare, end of quote. Had the popes been determined to save the Jews from their alleged perfidy, they, like Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, could have threatened them with exile. Though cruel and humiliating, the regulations that they did pass did not make life for Jews, as they had known it, impossible. Despite Paul's prohibitions, they continued to practice usury and deal in clothing, to congregate in their various synagogues and perform their ceremonies. If by the mid-17th century it was clear even to a foreigner that the obligatory sermons were more of a tedious ritual than an earnest attempt at religious programming, then the papacy too must have been perfectly aware that the ghetto had not succeeded in achieving its purported goal. Why then did the popes not try a little harder? Perhaps it was because they needed Jews for both practical and symbolic reasons. On the one hand, Jews contributed to the economy, helped subsidize urban festivities that added to Rome's magnificence, and were relatively obedient, subordinate, and self-sufficient. Were they to convert en masse, the city would lose its moneylenders and its patricians a guaranteed source of income, that is, the rents. On the other hand, the squalor of the neighborhood served as an effective public lesson. Despite the ghetto's invisibility in guidebooks, it is remarkable how many tourists, especially Protestant ones, who, I should add, were just as bedazzled by Rome's architectural splendor as any Catholic, and were equally quick to compare St. Peter's to the Temple of Solomon, made a detour into the ghetto in order to witness the quote-unquote bizarre customs of the Jews, above all circumcisions, which they described with little respect and a great deal of revulsion. If anything, the visual cacophony of the ghetto's architecture seems to reverberate in their derogatory comments on the dissonance of Hebrew chanting and convulsive prayer. The ghetto, in other words, was a spectacle, much like the carnival that the Jews were forced to run naked each year on the Corso, a powerful demonstration in living, though dreary, color of the fate in store for those who refused to embrace the true faith, and more pointedly, the primacy of Rome. Thus, just as heaven would have no meaning without hell, so too the New Jerusalem would never resound in its full glory without some lingering reference to the old. Thank you.
Irina. Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here, and I appreciate very much the invitation. I do want to say that we didn't coordinate our talks, but as you'll see, they fit perfectly together. Let me open with the words of Luigi Maria Benetelli di Vicenza, docente di Ebraico in Padova and Venice in 1603. He tells the following story. A Jew falls in a well, but it's the Sabbath, and so he says to a Christian who wants to save him, Sabata sancta colo, de stercore surgere nullo. Observing the Sabbath is my bit, then please leave me to rest in this vile and stinking pit. To which the Christian replies the following day, Sabbata nostra quidem, Salomon celebrabis idem. Our Sabbath too, you will delight in the same foul stew. Comment here is superfluous. As far as Bonelli is concerned, offal is where the Jew belongs. The offal in question being Judaism itself. And what this offal needed most was to be washed away, a job fit for the waters of a river. This brings us to Rome, the Tiber, and its Jews. To wit, the words of a poem composed right after the flood of December 24th, 1598, once more targeting the Jews. The river, seized at once the piazza of the Jews. A place this is, one of a kind. Then it went inside the ghetto to find the false, wicked, and fraudulent Jews, and if naked made them leave their beds. To them it would do disrespect, because they deserve it. These Jewish dogs who are the enemies of all Christians, perché lo meritano questi giudei cani che sono nemici di tutti I cristiani. It is though the Jews in their filth are flooding the city, which takes its revenge by flooding them back. The conflict between purity and impurity is clearer yet in the words of Filippo Maria Bonini from 1663. This obstinate people got some benefit from the flood. They refused to wash off the filth of the soul in baptismal waters, but at least those of the flooding Tiber wash off the dirt and stench of their bodies. Jews, it appears, prefer their own stench to consuming, by implication, the Eucharist of purification. The implication also is that Jews are oblivious to the regulations about public sanitation that were in force uniquely in Rome from no later than the mid-16th century. The truth, however, was the opposite. Sewage and drainage were as important to ghetto residents as they were to the rest of the city and its authorities. For example, the Talmud Torah Society, main school, needed to hook up a trench or a line or a pipe leading from various toilets and basins in its building to a sewer running down to the river. A job it undertook to free the school from, quote, the constant expense the current open trench caused. However, first it was necessary to get the proper licenses from the municipality, and then the consent of the tenants in the homes and stores under which the kiavika, the drain, was to pass. Excavations, columns, and conduits were to be dug and placed in the manner the architects and builders judged best. The pillars had to link the conduits to the chiavica maestro. This, which is part of an agreement, sounds like it was made yesterday. Its precision was the fruit of well-tried practice, not improvisation. Yet this agreement also points out the oxymoron of life in the Roman ghetto. As an icon, Jews were stigmatized, the epitome of filth, and we heard that just a minute ago. To be sure, however, the real filth that they were talking about was really the filth of the soul, regardless of what they actually saw. But in daily life, the Jews were like everyone else, punctilious as their neighbors in keeping their living space clean, or at least in trying to do so. For Christians, perceiving Jewish nature must have been challenging, just as ambivalences in Christian behavior must have challenged, if not confused, the Jews. A confusion that was surely increased by the many basics Rome's Jews and Christians shared alike: language, dress, food. Let us go and eat traditional Roman food, someone might say today. Where do they go? To the ghetto, to eat carciofi alla giudia, or fior di zucca, or filetti di baccalà, or carne seco, or coppiette. And I could go on. Non-Jews have been going to the kosher bakery forever. At one time, though, these were just plain Roman foods, as we know from lists of products that passed through the Roman port and its customs office. As for dress, we have long lists appended to marital agreements showing that the dress was in common. And language, even in the Hebrew records of formal public notarial documents, contracts, rentals, testimonies, the language that one hears is Italian, not just vocabulary, which is the most common phenomenon when speakers of one language live in the zone of another, but grammar and syntax. I once did an exercise in translating a Hebrew contract from these notaries back into Italian and forward into modern Hebrew. The differences were astounding. To wit, rentals were always of habayit shelah, which in Hebrew would read her house, never his house, but of course perfect Italian, casa sua. These people were clearly thinking in Italian. There was also dialect. Occasionally we hear the two Jews spoke Ebraico among themselves. This was not Hebrew, but what would become Judeo-Romanesco, with lovely usages like lazodde, hazothi, which is the cleaner, literally the woman for the Italian la donna di servizio. It was not only everyday usages that Jews absorbed. There were Jews like Rabbi Tranquillo Corcos, as the late Yosef Sermonetta amply demonstrated, who were students of Latin and Italian literature, even in the 18th century, which was the time of greatest woe for Roman Jews. One can see this in the writing of another Tranquillo, Tranquillo del Monte, telling the story in verse of his sister's release, still a Jew, from the Roman house of converts after a stay of 13 days in 1749. We see it even more in the second half of this verse epic by a Rabbi Moise Mieli, full of classic allusions. And let us delve down one step deeper yet into the story of Roman Jewish integration by examining the laws that governed the Jews' lives. Oh yes, Rome's Jews were ghettoized, but the law never stopped saying they were cives Romani, Roman citizens, living by jus commune, the law as commonly practiced, which, to cite more than one jurist, meant that the Jews enjoyed all the benefits of law as well as they were bound by its obligations. Yet, as we shall see, it was the former, the benefits, that posed the Jews' greatest problems, strange as it may sound. Nonetheless, for the moment, let us ask where else in Western or Central Europe did anyone, until 1791 in the French Revolution, think of calling Jews Cives, citizens, and actually treating them as such? Still, the real stumbling block for Roman Jews was the perception with which I began, that they were somehow impure, untouchable, and putrid, beyond cleansing, except through the waters of baptism. And didn't that make of them pariahs, regardless of their linguistic, cultural, culinary, and especially legal integration? In the words of Pius IX in 1871, as he despaired over the loss of the papal state and his direct control of Rome, and as he saw Jews wandering about freely after September 20th of 1870, now that the ghetto was a thing of the past, the Jews, he said, were going about per le vie latrare. The Jews, the dogs whom the kennel once had held in, were now befouling the holy city. And I would add that the term latrare, the howling that we heard about before, goes all the way back, even in a text of Gregory the Great in the 6th century. Jewish prayer is always howling and barking, latrantes ululantes. And by dogs, the popes meant the same thing as did the 4th century John Chrysostom, commenting on Matthew 15:26. The Jews, he said, were the dogs who should neither be given the Eucharist nor allowed to steal it back. They, the Jews who were once the children of God, were now dogs, while those who were once dogs, the Gentiles, had been called to be the children. Who stole the bread from the oven? The Eucharistic bread, of course, goes the rhyme in a game played by Chilean children. Answer, los perros judíos, the Jewish dogs. The game could well have been played in Rome. It still is, by the way, everywhere in Chile. The dogs were out to get the juggler of the Corpus Christi, whether as the Eucharist or as the civic corporate body, also known by this name. When Jewish lenders took interest, as one late medieval monk put it, they were hounds sucking the blood of the town, meaning that which kept it, the civic Eucharistic body, alive. Jewish economic malfeasance, therefore, or at least imputed malfeasance, was an existential threat. And the dog, the Jewish dog, was by definition contaminating. The city of Rome, by contrast, had to be kept pure. Pure as its flowing waters. Pure as those confessed and ready to accept the Eucharist. Pure as those baptized whose souls had been saved. Yet ideally, the cohort of the saved was destined to include the souls of the Jews, who were to be segregated until they too joined the ranks of the purified. This included keeping them out of sight and preventing them from even seeing that which was holy. For instance, Eucharistic processions and also Christian texts, whose reading and study was deemed somehow fraught with offense. The famous jurist Pignatelli wrote in the early 17th century that Jews may not use Christian doctrinal works while they study letters, Latin, or sciences, or the arts. If license to be taught these things is granted, it is to be done in a private home outside the ghetto, in a classroom where Christian youth are not present, and not on feast days, and only after the piety and doctrinal rectitude of the instructor have been certified. The ancient antecedents, the inherent fears of domination or defilement underlying the rules separating Jews and Christians had not only stayed alive, they had expanded, in fact, to the point that they were driving papal policies in unheard of ways. From the inception of the Roman ghetto in 1555, the entire structure of the previous hundreds of years, which had enabled Jewish-Christian coexistence, an equilibrium, best described as, quote, resident but unequal, was going to go into tilt until the Jewish community of Rome was nearly extinguished. And yet, the tense intimacy, as I have called it, of Jews and Christians in Rome remarkably continued, as did the cultural negotiation of Jews taking from the non-Jewish world what suited them, but rejecting the rest. That rest, however, being limited to very little other than Christianity itself, while the Jews, for their part, refused to give up being Jewish, as well as they remained disdainfully proud of their Jewish identity. The beginning of the crisis of the Jews and the popes, yes, we are speaking of Rome, but that is roughly the same as speaking of the popes, began in 1413, when the Castilian anti-pope, Benedict XIII, decided on an all-out policy of conversion. Earlier popes had not been averse to conversion, but nobody had made it the fulcrum of their policy. Till that time, and actually until the mid-16th century in Rome, the watchword was patience, while protecting Jews who, in the words of Pope Alexander II in 1062, accepted Christian rule. Read the limitations and denomination of the Pope. However, doubt was constantly growing. In the 13th century, Jewish literature was impugned, burned, and the Papal Inquisition was allowed to prosecute Jews helping converts to return to their original faith, that is, apostatize in Christian terms. John the 22nd thought Jews were guilty of black magic and may have expelled them temporarily from Avignon in 1322 just because of it. Previously, Jews had been expelled from France and England. However, the real problem was in Spain, where mendicants, especially Dominicans, were pushing heavily for conversion and often succeeding. Riots in 1391 created massive conversions, and in this spirit Benedict XIII issued Etsi Doctoris Gentium, predicted on virtually coercing Jews into Christianity by making it difficult to function as a Jew. The policy lasted 5 years. What happened during those years set a precedent. Etsi Doctoris and Cum Nimis Absurdum, the bull of Paul IV that founded the Roman Ghetto and launched this Pope's conversionary policy, look very much alike. Between 1412 and 1555, however, it was the turn of suspicion. In particular, the suspicions generated at Trent in 1475 when the Jews were accused of murdering a child named Simon. This was not the first such accusation, nor was the fury of the punishment of the town's Jewish males, all executed, unique. What differed was the caste of accusers. Not mendicant friars, nor even zealous lay rulers as in the past. This time the culprits were humanists, like Bishop Johannes Hinderbach of Trent, and their henchmen, people like Bartolomeo Platina, the Vatican librarian. Actually, its founder. The ones defending the Jews, or at least trying to stop the carnage, were most unexpectedly the Dominican Bishop de Judice and the Franciscan Pope Sixtus IV. Nonetheless, the notion that Jews committed crimes against Christianity had reached the highest echelons. The idea reverberated in 1569 and 1593, when Pius V and Clement VIII expelled Jews from the Papal State, once again raising John the 22nd's specter of black magic as a reason, but also raising Pius V's wrath against a Roman Jew who, using a crystal ball, was taking wagers about the date of the coming papal conclave, that is, about the date of Pius's death. Still, clever, huh? Still, it would be only in the 18th century that the theme of Jewish nefariousness would be fully played out. In the meantime, it was conversion that had become central. Catholic reform movements, begun even before Luther's time, were both missionary and eschatological in focus, and this entailed, among other things, missionizing the Jews. The Libellum ad Leonem Decem of 1513 devoted its major emphasis to proselytizing among Jews, and there were theories, like those of the Jesuit Francisco de Torres, that Jews would and could be forced to convert by impoverishing them and through other repressive acts. De Torres had obviously read Etsi Doctoris. Add to this the desires for unity stimulated by the Protestant Reformation. A word on unity, which is the key to what was really going on. a concept born with Paul in Corinthians and which is still very much alive. The unity in question is that of the Corpus Christi, the church itself, which is also known as the Corpus Christi Mysticum. The church, writes Paul in 1 Corinthians 10:16-18, becomes one through the participation of believers in the consumption of the communion wafer, eventually known as the Corpus Christi Verum. Together, they created the Societas Fidei, the Society of the Faithful, and its complement, the Corpus Politicum, civic government, it too known as the Corpus Christi. In other words, everything revolves around the ideal at least, of the unified and unitized Corpus Christi. Where do the Jews fit in? Except for Paul's concept that in Roman 11 that their conversion signals and actually hastens the apocalypse, they don't fit in at all. Why then did a Jewish presence endure? Apart from the words of Paul, the reason, at least in the papal state, what went on elsewhere is much too complex to broach here, is that from the year 212, Jews were made cives Romani, Roman citizens. This was a status they never lost. They retained it even in the codices of Theodosius and Justinian, with their heavy Christian orientation that made Jews into second-class and subordinate citizens, and it continued in the cities of medieval and early modern Italy, including the papal states, with echoes in canon law as well. The church thus inherited what it least wanted, a highly visible exception to the rule of unity, and worst, an exception that by its very existence reminded the church that it might be wrong. That supersession, the idea that the Jews had been supplanted by Christians as God's elect, might not be true. What is more, as we approach the 18th century, the matter would become even more pressing. Jews did not seem to care a whit about saving their souls, and the whole brunt of the church's effort as time went on seemed to be directed to just that. Saving souls, and I don't mean just of Jews, I mean in general, and in a Catholic as opposed to a Protestant way, through Catholic baptism. Not to mention that as we have begun to see, the old equilibrium between Christians and Jews had been unraveling since 1555. The original signals of a brewing crisis were given in a strange way. In the 80 years or so prior to 1555, the popes had worked out an equitable system of direct taxation, learning by experimenting with the Jews, who did their own estimates and paid as a block. But from the early 1550s, the popes changed gears and began to fine the otherwise fully licensed Jewish banks for charging exorbitant interest. The popes were trying to break the Jews financially, which they finally did in 1682 when they closed the banks. Although, truth be told, by that time, the papally sponsored Roman Monte di Pietà loan fund, known to you better today as Banca di Roma, had taken over 90% of the loans. They just simply squeezed these banks out of business, and none of them had really ever been large to begin with. The Jews did not see what was coming, although they should have. They were certainly shocked when the Talmud was condemned and burned in 1553 and 1554. Yet this they thought would pass. It never did. And even then it took about 30 years to assimilate Paul IV's great policy shift of 1555. The Pope wants all the Jews to live together, said one woman deposing before a Jewish notary. The rest of Cum Nimis Absurdum's tough economic legislation and its insistence on special Jewish clothing passed her by, or so she made it seem. In fact, 11 years earlier, in 1544, a first attempt at a ghetto had been made, but it never went beyond the papal order. Now the walls were built, and quickly. But it was only in 1589, when the ghetto was overcrowded and there was a need for more space, and some Jews hoped to get permission to live outside, but were denied it, that they realized that their world had changed. They were living, as they put it, in nostro get. The pun on ghetto and the word get, or divorce in Hebrew, was intentional, to the point that eventually Jews began to write get as gimel tet in Hebrew. The get, by the way, is given to and held by the former wife. So the Jews identified themselves the weaker of the two spouses, yet still spouse, meaning they never wanted to break fully with the outside, and as said, they never did. Besides, every day people came in and out of the ghetto during daylight hours. Christians entered to do business, and Jews left. The wall was not a prison, hermetically sealed. Rather, it was the enclosure of a kennel where dogs are kept out of harm's way, that is, from causing harm. There were advantages, too. Jews saw the ghetto wall as a sacred space. They pretended that it was the wall of Jerusalem, and now we see the obverse of what we heard earlier. Never quite saying so, but the impression is strong that they did see it that way. Jews, by the way, went back and forth to the land of Israel, even then, including women on their own. One woman, in fact, used her stay in the land of Israel as a reason to break an engagement. The ghetto also allowed Rome's Jews to keep their 5 synagogues relatively undisturbed, all in one building. So undisturbed, in fact, that they kept fighting each other about putting up staircases, walls, and so on, because the space was limited. On one occasion, however, in 1557, a forbidden book was discovered in the Ashkenazi synagogue, which was being rented. The number of Ashkenazi Jews was very small, actually, and it was being rented from the Scola Nova, leading to the former's closing, and then to the internal litigation after the Ashkenazi synagogue reopened. The question: did the Ashkenazi owe the Scola Nova back rent? This may be the moment to mention that Rome's Jews were composed largely of those who had lived in the city for hundreds and hundreds of years. There had been immigrants from the areas around Rome in the 16th century, and Jews expelled from Sicily and the Kingdom of Naples arrived at about the same time, actually just a little later, plus Jews from Iberia, whose precise number is hard to fix. They formed their own synagogues and had power conflicts, but the matter became reasonably academic from about the mid-16th century. The out-marriage rate, that is, the marriages between Jews of different groups, simply grew too high, well over 20%, which incidentally and interestingly is almost identical in time and process to what has gone on in Israel since 1948. That is, marriage between different Jewish groups. One often reads about huge ethnic conflicts. The evidence is slim and I don't buy it. Conflicts, yes, but more political and economic than anything else. These conflicts surfaced in the communal council, the communitas' nominal central institution. Yet what gave the Jews life and kept them going more than anything else was not the formal council and its activities, nor any imagined oligarchies. They didn't exist. The efficient source of power and animation in a manner of speaking, for they facilitated communal self-governance, but did not actually control it, were the Jewish notaries. Their activity was itself a very recent development in the city, indeed among Jews at all. I am referring to the true practice of what is known as the ars dictaminis, the notarial art, creating formulae and taking down testimony that provides a public record of what truly was said, that is, court testimony. The standardization of forms the Piatellis, the leading notaries, worked out over 60 years, father and son, with the great longevity of the latter, provided Rome's Jews with a reliable early modern bureaucratic base. It also persuaded most of these Jews that it was better to engage in consensual arbitration within the community than to turn, as was possible, and as it did happen, to civic courts. There are amazing stories from these notaries, but I don't have time to tell them tonight. I have to send you to Theater of Acculturation, like the story of Rika da Versa, who cries crocodile tears while she's mouthing Jewish law, and at the end says, "He didn't write me since he left Rome," which was actually citing a legal precedent of someone else who broke an engagement as she was trying to do. Or Shem Tov Saporto, who claimed that his wife was not a virgin, and then in fact it outed that he had been, quote-unquote, nodded that is, made impotent, and he had to resort to some stratagem in order to get his virility back, at which point the community was furious and made him double the dower, the jointure, which the bride receives. Only she got it, whereas in Christian circles it was given to the father. It was her honor which was considered impugned, which is interesting. But these stories I can't tell you. Not because it's not interesting. And it was precisely this Jewish self-governance, to get back to the point, to the extent that it existed, that was most disturbing to the authorities. Apart from a traditional resistance to Jewish power, as in Genesis 49:10, to a Jewish sense of self-governance and cohesion, it was clear that a community with a fixed public and civic ritual would stick together. The church wanted to take that community apart. The goal, however, was not destruction, but total Jewish integration, much as citizens are integrated into a modern state, although in the papal state this also meant through conversion. To achieve its goal, the papal administration was going to move in two ways, or at least it would try to do so, and fail. The first was through direct conversionary pressure. The second was by making the Jews feel helpless, in particular by forcing them to give up their communal institutions, not in name but in terms of communal heft. In particular, Jews were going to be pushed to adjudicate all disputes in external Roman tribunals and to live by the general law of the land, jus commune, even in matters of marriage and inheritance. Now, should we put aside the underlying conversionary purpose of this legal turn, please put it aside, it sounds as though the Jews were being headed toward emancipation. Did not the French Revolution of 1791 do just this? Absorb the Jews legally, making them citoyens, true citizens, while ending their distinct communal existence. Indeed it did, but with one most crucial difference. The French revolutionary state, like its American parallel, was a deconfessionalized one. That is, the state religion was one of having no state religion. The state was to be a secular one, in which all citizens live equally under equal law, with no caste or other distinction of privilege, at least in theory. The papal state, by contrast, was a confessional one. This means that legal absorption was going to be a tool of conversion. It was also going to be a tool molded by the kind of fear mentioned earlier, that Jews would attack the Corpus Christi at every opportunity. Nonetheless, this fear did not deter the state from pursuing its vision of unity. To be sure, the Catholic Church shared this vision with other states in its day, including Protestant ones, but the papal state was unique, paradoxically so in fact, in making the absorption of Jews, rather than their exclusion or expulsion, part of its vision. Certainly no other state, except France, of course, was also moving toward a true legal homogenization of all. Yet because homogenization included conversion, it appears that the papal state was moving both forward and away from state modernity, and one at the same time. I hope you appreciate this odd paradox, going in both ways at once. It wants to make everyone live equally under law, but as a Catholic, so it's going two ways. It was in the spirit of homogenization and amalgamation that the state sought to detach the Jews from the observance of Jewish law. Medieval legalists had no trouble with Jews observing their own law. As late as 1558, Marquardus de Susanis, who summed up all the laws pertaining to Jews in a 300-page tract, was very clear. Only where Jewish law contradicted common legal practice was it not allowed. By 1622, Antonio Riccioli, who had been papal vice-regent in charge of life in Rome, said that what Jews could observe was Mosaic law, that is, the law of the Torah, hence not rabbinic law. In one fell swoop, he had emasculated Jewish legal procedure. Talmudically based law, just as the Talmud itself, which was what Jewish law and practice was all about, was no longer allowed, and this was both in theory and practice. The record shows that Jews were forced more and more to turn to civil, read Roman, papally run courts. A decision of the High Court of the Roman Rota, a year before Riccioli spoke out, in 1621, said virtually the same thing. The result, Jewish women could not inherit freely as in the past. Disputes about engagement, for instance, once resolved within the community, went straight to the vicar. And worse, nobody wanted to hold public office within the Jewish community, since all that meant in effect was collecting taxes for the Pope. Potential Jewish leaders also had reason to be afraid. From 1702, if not earlier, it was made clear that should they do anything to hinder papal programs, especially conversionary ones, they would be severely punished. The conversionary campaign was reaching new heights, and the community itself was floundering. Let me retrace. Since 1555, Jews had been in the ghetto. Their Talmud had been burned, and shortly after, from 1584, they were forced to listen to conversionary sermons in a church just outside the ghetto wall. Their economy was restricted, and the only respite was a cruel one, when up to 20% of Rome's Jews perished in the Great Plague of 1656 that hit the rest of Rome equally, by the way. Many ghetto buildings were now empty, for whose rent the community was forced to pay. The policy advocated by De Torres of making Jews suck at husks for sustenance was paying off, and there were conversions, especially at the lower end of the social scale, about 10 a year. Yet being a convert was no picnic. Converts were supposed to have been regenerated, made into, quote, new men. But in fact, there was deception. Converts mostly lived outside the ghetto walls. They were forbidden contact with their families, although they might gain their inheritance as soon as they converted, another blow to the family. And to ensure discipline among converts, they were obligated to join a special confraternity where their every move was watched. Only some women may have been fortunate enough to have made a decent match, as they were promised in conversionary propaganda. Obviously, those who remained Jews knew the facts. So while the conversionary policy had its successes, as a whole, it flopped. Besides, in 1555, Paul IV, as many others of his contemporaries, was messianically motivated. He foresaw Jewish mass conversion as a result of placing the Jews in a ghetto, and he dreamed of seeing the millennium in his own day. So had St. Paul, for that matter. But the millennium, need I say, tarried, and mass conversion did as well. The policy of integration through religious elimination was also stymied by the need of the papal administration somehow to keep the ghetto afloat. The alternative was to have to feed another 4,000 poor. So the state worked out a system of loans, actually government bonds, which fictitiously the Jews sold and on which they paid interest, which of course they could not afford, sinking the community ever more deeply into debt. The popes were attempting simultaneously to destroy yet preserve Rome's Jews. Moreover, the policy of integration had to be modified, just as the ends themselves were evolving in tune with changes in Europe as a whole. In 1555, there was still hope to reunite Europe religiously. By the mid-17th century, the hope had been reduced to achieving stabilization and, with luck, the ability to nibble away at the holdings of the other. The 30 Years' War that ended in 1648 had led to religious cantonization, but also to the realization that religious competition would not occur through arms, but through persuasion, better propaganda, and more convincing claims to possess the truth. And here, please recall, I'm speaking not so much of Jews, but of attempts by Catholics to gain back Protestants and of Protestants to gain Catholics. What could be be more convincing than Jewish conversion, however, even if that conversion was limited, not to mention that the Protestants were barely competitors. Protestant conversionary institutions, that is, directed at Jews, did not take shape until the 18th century, and they were weak and few and far between. Although in common with the Catholics, Protestants too were always suspicious about the sincerity of converts and their conversion. Catholics had been developing conversionary institutions known as the Case de Catechumeni since Ignatius Loyola had first proposed them in 1542. The one in Rome was especially developed and fearsome. It was here that the greatest dramas were going to take place. Indeed, while the papal state as a whole was moving its Jews towards homogeneity through weakening their communal resolve, including by a particularly draconian reenactment and extension of older privileges by Pius VI in 1775, alongside the ever greater Jewish amalgamation into jus commune, it was also busy elaborating a way of virtually forcing individual conversions. Its tool was the Casa de Catechumeni and its adepts, and the Casa's tools of all things were principles of the modern state. A nice, neat package. Medieval theologians were united that conversion was a product of free will. But what about children? Young children, of course. Jus commune said Jewish children were under their parents' patria potestas, parental right and privilege. Yet parents had the right to decide whether a child converted, or the parents had the right to decide whether a child converted or remained a Jew. But from the 16th century, legists began to question whether only parents, mothers and fathers that is, possessed that power. And by the 17th century, and very firmly in the 18th, it was being said that in the event of a conversion, that power was transferred from a parent to the converted relative. Even a maternal aunt or uncle could exercise it, which they would do by offering a child to the church. The justification was the concept of favor fidei, the favor of the faith. This was a legal concept, not an excuse. It dates at least to Gratian in the 12th century. Nevertheless, its use emphasizes how determinant religious advantage had become in deciding what one would imagine, indeed what had always been, a civil matter. However, just because the state was confessional, the religious and the civil here fully blended. Thus, in 1716, the legist and judge Giuseppe Sessa of Turin wrote that just as the state drafts soldiers and acts in loco parentis, so did it have the power to assign custody of the child. Could anything be more modern than that? Or any less, for Sessa intended the custody to go to the converted relative. And indeed, the result of his thinking, certainly as it was applied in Rome, but also in Sessa's own Piedmont, was a series of effective kidnappings. An uncle, a converted mother or father, or a fiancé who could claim that a betrothal had taken place could oblate a child or fiancé who would literally be imprisoned in a casa de catechumeni for a quarantine, 40 days. Now you know the origin of the word quarantine. Most of whom broke and converted. An exception was Anna del Monte in 1749, who had been taken to the casa in Rome at gunpoint by the Sbirri, the papal police. Her family, along with a lawyer, no doubt one skilled in jus commune, and the Jews used such a lawyer often, because Anna's case was not unique, managed to prove that the one who had offered her, a Sabato Cohen, was not at all her betrothed. Anna was released after only 13 days. Miraculously, or not so miraculously, for just to prove how devoted the papal administration was to erecting a unified legal entity, it too obeyed the law. The pursuit of legality, one might say, was a mania, and the body that was most rigid in ensuring legal observance was the Papal Inquisition. Reality is never simple, is it? In the same vein, real assent to baptism, however it was what was construed, one could be tricked into saying he or she believed in God and so be assumed to have assented to Christian belief, was critical. Not only was assent canonically mandated, it was held to be the key to demonstrating Christian Catholic truth. The soul, through the sacrament of the Catholic baptism, it was said willingly to receive, and through nothing else, and in no other way, was saved. Ana del Monte thus was urged over and over during her stay in the casa to elect salvare l'anima, to save her soul, not to have faith, not to believe, but to save her soul through baptism. She, however, having no sense of the Christian Catholic concept of the soul, and I assure you she didn't, or even more of its need to be saved, was dumbfounded. She said, "Send me home." That's what she said. But the church did not let up, so wholly absorbed as it was with the question of the soul and its salvation. Doctrines, too, were evolving. In the later 17th century, it was beginning to be said that the soul entered the fetus at the instant of conception. Previously, it had been at 40 or 80 days, male and female respectively, which, among other things, made room for abortions, however frowned upon. By the later 18th century, in 1769 to be precise, it had become canonically illegal to say that abortion was not infanticide. It was also being said that in the case of a mother possibly dying in childbirth, a cesarean section should be performed, obviously guaranteeing the mother's death, to enable baptizing any living part of the fetus. This story would seem to be for another talk, except that these chilling concepts, except perhaps the very last, were also being applied to pregnant Jewish women whose fetuses had been offered. To protect the souls of their unborn offspring, already deemed Christian, these expectant mothers could be sequestrated and kept in the casa of de catechumeni, the house of converts, until they gave birth, when their newborn would immediately be baptized. Any Jew who helped such women flee before being sequestrated was liable to heavy punishment, and Jews were suspected of the worst. Even Giuseppe Sessa, whom I consider a moderate, who recognized clear Jewish rights and who had been in charge of Jewish judicial affairs in Turin, said that Jews were so malicious in their attitudes toward Christianity that they would rather kill their children than see them baptized. As proof, he referred both to past historiae and their witness, and the death in Prague in 1694 of one Shimon Abelus on the eve of Shimon's own conversion, a murder supposedly at his father's hands and committed in odium fidei, in hatred of the faith, the classic term for ritual murder. Jews would do anything to prevent conversion, and the dead child was also to be considered a martyr, which is to say, a Eucharistic surrogate, as all Catholic martyrs were considered through the ages. If then, in 1751, Pope Benedict XIV said observing the deeds of Jews in contemporary Poland made him wonder what the monk Rudolf would say, Rudolf, who during the Second Crusade in 1146 preached murdering Jews, we can understand his thinking. Not accept, just understand. The Church was laboring to amalgamate Jews, to save their souls, to make their status as Chihuahuas, as citizens, a complete one, and the Jews were responding with murder, ritual murder at that. Pope Benedict also issued the bull Beatus Andreas in 1755. This was the first time, actually the only one, that a pope had approved a charge of ritual murder. Need I observe I better observe the computer. Need I observe that Benedict's pontificate marks the nadir of papal-Jewish relations. Benedict, as may be imagined, was also fighting modernity, as well as the Enlightenment, and ideas like those that would lead to the French Revolution. It was no accident that in 1793, on January 17th, the date chosen by the current Pope Benedict to visit the Roman synagogue, known as the Moed de Piombo, a mob besieged the Roman ghetto, charging its inhabitants with aiding the Jacobins. The Jews had been identified with modernity, the Corpus Christi's new main adversary. In one way or another, as Jews were still the fearful dogs of John Chrysostom, the ones he suspected of constantly trying to steal the children's Eucharistic bread. Napoleon would change everything, at least for a short period, but his exit meant another 7 decades of ghetto existence, weakened in all ways individually and communally, not to mention financially, and under continual challenge to their very Jewish existence, their deep acculturation into Italian ways notwithstanding. Roman Jews, for the time being, had only one way out, one refuge, which was the family. Most interestingly, not only were families small, with fewer than two children on average, even though women were marrying earlier when statistically they were more fertile, but husbands and wives were rarely more than 18 months apart in age, which is known as an important agent in promoting emotional ties and mutual support. Italian Jews, said the demographer Livy Bacci, were pioneers in the realm of family limitation. It appears that they were avatars of modernity too when it came to family composition and what many consider ideal family goals. A small family, however, had other advantages, in particular limiting the number of collateral relatives, the very ones who might be suspect of making an offering upon their possible conversion. Small families also ensured an equitable, or at least a more equitable, distribution of wealth, another tool to fight the conversion that financial inequities are also said to have helped bring about. Yet even this defense was no guarantee against offerings, nor for that matter against clandestine secret baptisms performed, it was said, on the verge of death. The Mortara case of 1858 is known to all, as are its results in laying the groundwork for the Papal State's demise. Yet even that was not the final chapter. Champions of confessionalism raised their head anew with Mussolini's instructions to his education minister Gentile in 1922 to insert religion into the schools and to make attendance obligatory at classes taught by priests, many of whom were swimming in the murky waters of the renewed charges of ritual murder found in the periodical La Civiltà Cattolica and of alleged Jewish assaults on, quote, lo stesso cristianesimo, Christianity itself, as it was phrased by Bishop Antonio de Paul in 1885, speaking of one purported victim, Lorenzino de Marostica. The old had not been erased, and the racial laws of 1938 met with little opposition, sometimes the opposite. And in this light, I would like to close going back to a 13th century medieval Hebrew source known as the terrible event of the year 1007. During a persecution and forced conversion, the instigator, the Duke of Normandy, raises his sword to kill a Jew who had asked to appeal to the Pope. But the sword flew out of the Duke's hand, flipped over, and pierced his palm. This is precisely the sword with a golden tassel or belt whose mishandling by unworthy pretenders to be the Knight of the Grail and the Grail romances led to their injury or death. The Grail, of course, being a Eucharistic symbol and surrogate, while the Grail stories themselves often speak or at least imply ill of Jews. Seeing, therefore, that he was an unworthy contender and that he was not the one elected to pursue Jews, the Duke concedes and allows the Jew, one Jacob ben Yekutiel, to travel to Rome. Upon hearing that the Jews consider themselves subject to papal jurisdiction, a just rule, Memshelet Rashut, Jacob says, the Pope sends a messenger, a bishop, proclaiming words found in the famous text of Jewish protection, Sicut Judais Non, and the raised papal voice, by way of the legate, brought the persecution to a halt. Thank you.
So now we have at least 10 minutes for some questions for our speakers. We have a microphone, so you just can raise your hand.
I think there's a different tactic. Very different. I do a lot of work on the word. And Aaron was more like unite, sort of like reborn Christians.
Maristella Lorch, Columbia.
Could you speak? The microphone is not on.
Of course. You have mentioned en passant the question of food, Jews and food, and I remember the importance that Jewish food had during fascism, before obviously the famous laws, racial laws. And I'm wondering whether restaurants that existed, this is a very specific question because it has something to do with the book that I'm writing, whether restaurants that existed during that period, like Piperno, still exist today and still have the reputation of being the holders of the old Roman cooking, like the famous carciofi, the artichokes, carciofi alla Giudia. Whether this particular restaurants or analogous restaurants still exist today. I could definitely, in one of my visits to Rome, go myself to look at it, but I take advantage of this magnificent event at the Academy to ask you personally whether you are aware of it.
I'm not sure, is the microphone working? First of all, it's a delight. You have been a name for me for many, many years, so it's a wonderful delight to meet you in person. The fact is there's been a large change. Piperno still exists, but of course Piperno is not owned by Jews. So you can have prosciutto alla Giudia.
Of course you can have it in New York in good Italian restaurants.
Oh, you should see an article that someone sent me the other day about matzo balls made in bacon fat. So I just eat plain bagels. Don't mix foods. What's happened though in the past 4 or 5 years is there has been this large resurgence of Jewish food in the ghetto area, and that includes 4 or 5 kosher restaurants. So I think that they've sort of taken over, especially with the fritti and so on and so forth. People still go to Ghetto, which is very turistico, need I say. Everybody knows, don't go there. And Paperno is still prepares these foods, as does Pompieri, but the ghetto just looks entirely different from what I knew when I first saw it in 1972, and there really wasn't even a kosher restaurant. There was just Boccione, the bakery. We won't say why it's called Boccione. We would. But it's so it's a different world. But that food is really an enormous renaissance.
You have underlined a very important point, that the Jews of the ghetto were truly Romans. In fact, I lived for many years with the idea that they were the only extant surviving of the Romans themselves. And food was in a way an expression, but the language they use. Also, I think you haven't mentioned it, but you have hinted to it, to the fact that during the Renaissance, the Jews, the great Jewish scholars, were truly collaborating with Roman scholars and with European scholars, and we have some great names among the Jews discoverers that are universally recognized. So the ghetto was not kept close to the world. There was, without the pushing to the conversion, they were allowed to come out and communicate. More specifically, how would you characterize the Jewish ghetto at its high point? I don't know whether you want to take the 16th century or later on, and the Venetian ghetto.
I shy away from contrasting the Roman ghetto to the Venetian ghetto for many reasons. First, I don't know anything about the Venetian ghetto. Not as much as I know about Rome, so I have to admit my limits. But more important, the Roman ghetto was really a conglomerate of all kinds of Jews from all kinds of places, which I think found a way to operate itself through these Roman notaries. In Theater of Acculturation, I go on quite at length about it. You can call it a theory, not a theory. Somebody wrote a few weeks ago that I was resurrecting theories of Yitzhak Bear, of some pre-existent Jewish ideal form of government, which of course I wasn't. I was talking about nuts and bolts testimony and what it says. But the Venetian ghetto is made up of these commercial people who've been brought in, explicitly welcomed, following actually the lead of Paul III in 1534 in Ancona. And then you have all the Ashkenazic Jews who pre-exist there, who are the bankers. And so it's really two worlds. The community itself, to the extent it exists, really exists because the two synagogues cooperate with each other. The synagogues in Rome are they're there, but they're ancillary. They're confraternities, and I once contrasted the power of the community to the power of the synagogue, because they call the synagogues universitas sometimes, but they're just throwing the term around very loosely. The synagogue is really a confraternity of one. Well, the whole Roman community is a confraternity because it's not a corporation. Despite what people think, it's not a corporation. The legalists all go batty trying to say it's not a corporation and can't be. It's not a full corporation. It looks like one, acts like one, but isn't one. So there are two different worlds. The populations are different. The fates of the populations are different. The people running it are different. The Venetians want to segregate the Jews to preserve the purity of the Corpus Christi of their city, but they don't have any particular religious desire to convert them, nor do they go on this whole thing of trying to legally amalgamate them, which I think of all the modes of trying to pursue conversion, that was the most effective, apart from when they simply grabbed somebody and put them in the casa di catechumeni and squeezed the juices out of them. Someone asked a question.
A much more lowly question. for both of you, is there any evidence of love affairs or marriages between Christians and Jews from the ghetto?
I don't know of any. Sorry. I mean, I deal more with the art than with the social connections between them, but I never heard of any.
Well, marriage is, of course, out of the question. The only way you can marry is by becoming something else. And what you can become is Christian, because you certainly can't become Jewish. That's a capital offense. You can... love affairs? I don't know about love affairs, but sexual affairs, undoubtedly. That we know. That goes on all the time. There are some people who want to try to say there was a lot of it. There's some people who want to say, no, it happened once. Let's agree that it was somewhere in between. We can't really know. I mean, I have a little bit of evidence of this kind of thing, but unless we had complete court records, that's the only way that a thing like this shows up. You don't have people writing diaries.
Okay. So I would like to ask a question that actually goes more, I think, to the first presentation. I was very struck by the dialectic that you set up between the tension towards assimilation and the use, or towards conversion and annihilation of a specific identity of the Jews, and their use to demarcate the Christian space and to define Rome as the New Jerusalem. And you said in closing, it was the utility of the Jews that enabled their preservation as Jews in Rome. At least that's what I understood you to be saying. So in a sense, my question, and I really appreciated that, and coming from Rome myself as a Jew, I especially appreciate it. But my question has to do with, when does that dialectic cease? And in a way, I'm wondering, in part also because of the references to the Pope's most recent visit to the synagogue a month ago, or a few months ago, is there a continuing or a resurgent or a recurrent use of the Jewish population and of the iconography of Jews, even in the current scene, to help to create alternative visions, for example, of Roman identity? Or so when does that usefulness of the Jew cease, if it has?
Well, the ghetto was torn down in the 19th century, and I mean, I'm dealing mostly with the Counter-Reformation and the 16th and the 17th century. So I think at that point, there was not a very concerted effort to convert the Jews, precisely because they were necessary, as I pointed out, for symbolic reasons and also for economic ones. And it's important also to remember that this is a point when thousands and thousands of people are being converted in the New World with very different tactics. So if the Romans if the papacy and the Jesuits, and even more so the Oratorians, who were very skilled at converting Jews, had wanted to convert them at that point, they could have tried a bit harder. What happens in the 19th century, everything changes by then. For recent times, I don't know to what extent. It is true that there is this ghetto in Rome, which is very defined as Jewish. And I think it's been emphasized after World War II, after the Holocaust. But, other than that, at this point, I think it's a very different situation from what I'm talking about.
May I add something to that? I agree fully with the notion that it was possible to exploit the Jews symbolically. This is the whole thing. We're saved, you're damned. Here's visible demonstration of this kind of thing. I agree, too, that the conversionary program is redimensioned. I, in fact, even alluded to that in my talk, where I said they began to work in the hope of getting individuals as representative of it. However, the presence of the Jews is something, and this is fundamental, because there's a whole bunch of stories that go around something called an Augustinian Theory, which supported the Jews in the early Middle Ages, except that it didn't exist because nobody referred to it. until Innocent III, which is the 13th century. So it's kind of hard to say it exists. There are a lot of myths. Jews were kept around because they essentially, once you admitted a Jew, you were legally stuck with a Jew. Jews did have this civil status. The amount of legal material on the Jews is enormous. You couldn't just pick up and get rid of them. You could limit them and say, well, they were a little dangerous in certain parts of the papal state. But to pick up on them and really unload them, this for the popes was impossible. There was Pauline theology. There was the law. The two dovetailed together, and more or less, all the legal opinion says you can't get rid of Jews. You have to live with them. Could they have really converted Jews? Well, I think a few more here, a few more there. I do think they kept trying. I just don't think. I think that at a certain point they realized it wasn't going to happen. But no matter how skilled people were in converting individuals, that I don't think that really would have made a difference with the large group. I mean, the Jews had this tremendous sense of being who they are. If you listen to this Anna Del Monte, or at least the words that are ascribed to her, it's, who are you? Who are you Christians? What do you want? What do you? We have our God and our words, and then these are the right words, and we're very proud to be Jews. So all the preaching is also difficult. People do believe, people do convert, and they become ferocious like Paolo Medici. But these are people who are suddenly convinced they have a soul which needs to be saved. And most Jews, when you go to them and say you have a soul need to be saved, they say, what are you talking about? I may have a soul, but it doesn't need to be saved. And so you're preaching to me, that I should go out and buy ice cream when I'm allergic to milk, or maybe that's not a perfect enough analogy. So the hope is there, the wish is there, but the implementation changes at different kinds. I think for 30 or 40 years in the 16th century they were really, really heavy at it. Then they realized they have to do it bit by bit, and the preaching, heaven knows what, I never really know how to judge that thing. It was there, the popes had edicted it, so what are you going to do? You can't stop it. They tried their very best, but it didn't work. Nobody's listening, as you said.
This is a small question. Those of us who saw at the Primo Levi showing of the Gold of Rome, it seemed there was only one synagogue, and in the 1940s, was there more than one synagogue in Rome?
1940. To the best of my knowledge, and I wouldn't want to swear on this, there were, in 1940, before people came from Tripoli, of course, in the late 60s, which changed the entire face of Roman Jewry, there was an oratorio in Via Balbo, apart from the Tempio Maggiore, which is the main synagogue, and the Spola Tempio actually is shortened for the synagogue, for the temple of the destroyed, for the synagogue of the destroyed temple. That's the actual name of it. But there was the main synagogue, and down below it always was the Catalan synagogue, which maintained its right, whatever that means. It's rather vague because it's basically Roman. And then also this small oratorio and an oratorio de Castro. So I think they existed because outside the ghetto after 1870, people moved. They moved to Piazza Vittorio, where there's the big market today, and so on and so forth. I think this should be the last question, though.
This slide? That's the interior of St. Peter's with a picture of the ghetto inside, between the Solomonic columns.
Yeah, that's what she did. You won't find it, but it's great. I love it. I think that's a good thing. All right. Just quickly a question, yes.
What is the origin of the word ghetto?
Well, that's
your
easy.
question.
That's easy. That's easy. It's the name of the island in Venice where the first ghetto was established in 1516. The name pre-exists. Ghetto is probably from the foundry where they would cast the metal to make the ingots or whatever, and it was just that was the name of the island. So they said, let's put the Jews in the ghetto, and the name stuck. In the Roman papal documents, it's Seralio Hebreorum, Septem Hebreorum, things like that. It's only later on.
I had thought that it was Venetian dialect, the word ghetto.
It could be, but it's the name of the island, yes.